Hi everybody. It is Sunday night, and so I thought I would come and say a few words about your last week's work and the work that is ahead of us this week. So first of all, I was very pleased with the CritterCam exercises, and there was a wonderful range of CritterCams that you accessed. Let's see, some of you looked at the Kitami National Park Alaska CritterCam, mostly looking at brown bears. Other people looked at gray wolves. Puffins caught the attention of several people. A giant panda, the hummingbird, eagles, penguins, puppies, and an ocean cam at Cape Fear. So we had good representation both across undomesticated species, wildlife, and also one domesticated species of dogs, and then finally one cam just trained on the ocean itself in Cape Fear. So, very good range. Now I want to talk a little bit more about what this exercise was doing. I certainly told you something about the CritterCam and the kinds of perspectival changes that we can get as a result of using them. But I want to think a little bit more with you through what this exercise was doing and hopefully developing in you as observers. So the first thing that I'm sure you noticed, given the way the exercise was set up, was that the CritterCam exercise was meant to illustrate the difference between objective and subjective points of view, or if you want to put this a little bit differently, the difference between information or data and the interpretation of information or data. These are very different things, right? As an observer in the timed observations, you were required to make objective, to record objective materials, right? And in your reflection sections, you were asked to think subjectively and as an interpreter about what that data might mean or not mean. The exercise was also designed to get you to think a little bit more about how researchers formulate research questions. On the one hand, right, you might say, well, a researcher begins the research process with a question. And usually that's true. But that question gets refined, changed, revised many, many times during the process. And of course, it gets revised and changed based, at least in part, on the evidence and the data that is gathered. The exercise was also designed to engage you in a form of attention that we don't often engage in, and that is, what does it mean to be an observer? Maybe you could use the word witness, but I think observer is a little bit different, right? A witness tends to be less involved. An observer is someone who is hopefully really taking note of everything that's going on. And also, through this process, to expose you to something about the nature of field work, right? How fascinating it is, how frustrating it is, how enormously time-consuming it is. All of those things are of course, involved in field work and in any kind of research that involves patient sifting through data. All right, so I want to talk to you a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses, the general strengths and weaknesses that I found in your exercises. And I'm doing this because you have the opportunity to do a second CritterCam, right, as extra credit. And some of you may really want to take that opportunity. And if you do, I'd like you to have the benefit of some general response. So first of all, on the good side, right, most of you appear to be relatively objective observers and honest observers. And by this I mean you didn't appear to alter your data to present a kind of picture of what you were seeing that might have been more interesting than it actually was. That's very important. That might seem like a given, but actually it's a very, very important feature of research, right? And that's honesty and the integrity of the research. Some other strengths, and here I'm going to start with the strengths really in the timed observation section, is that many of you showed an awareness of the camera itself And I thought this was very important because while in one sense the critter cam seems to promise us a kind of unmediated view of whatever we're looking at, in another way it is of course itself a mediation. Right? It's an instrument of mediation, it's a technology. We're not looking directly at the animals or the environment that we're observing, but we're looking through a camera, and that camera is in some very basic way controlling what we see. So that fact that many of you showed an awareness of the camera, what it was doing, how it was influencing what you saw, I thought was very, very important. Many of you also offered quite detailed and quite precise observations on the prime, what I would call the prime subjects of your exercise. In other words, if you were looking at bears, brown bears, you told me a great deal about what you saw in brown bears. If you were looking at puffins, you gave me very detailed descriptions of the puffins. Some of you, and this is a little bit, in fact, much rarer, but very good when it happened, some of you touched on the symbiotic relationships between the primary animal you were observing and other animals that appeared in the scene. That was remarkable when that happened. And it happened at least a few times in observations of bears. A few of you mentioned, one of you in a very detailed and convincing way, right, the interrelationship between the bears and birds. And in doing that, right, you began to draw a more complex picture of the environment. That's very important. And so it's sort of a word to the rest of you who might not have had the opportunity, right, or might not have thought to observe other relationships happening that you were an observation of, but please do. A few of you commented on the larger ecosystems in which the animal you were observing was living. That was, again, right, just a few of you. Most people made some very basic comments about where they were looking. Might have been a forest, right, or a field, or something like this. But only a few of you really looked carefully at the environment. And when I say at the environment or the ecosystem, I mean all kinds of things. The weather, right, the atmosphere, the temperature, the inorganic and organic elements, everything that makes up that scene. That's very, very important to do. Right? So think of these observations as layered, having various layers, and you want to keep adding as many layers as possible. Now, most of you relied, and I think I know why, right? You relied on primarily one sense, and that sense was sight. This is very cultural, right? It's something that most of us do. If we are sighted ourselves, right, we rely immensely on that sight. But most of the critter cams that you used also had audio, and only a few of you recorded sounds that you heard. Work on this. Right? Work on adding senses to your observations. Yes, you're going to use your eyes, right? But also use your ears. And also think about the senses that we cannot really put into play when we are observing something through a critter cam. Right? We don't have the benefit of touch, right, of that kind of sensation. We don't have the benefit of smell. These are important losses, too. So both recording everything that we can and also being aware of blind spots, right, or things that we can't record may also be a part of this exercise. Okay, so now let's talk about a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of the reflections. And predictably, the reflections were, frankly, less proficient than the timed observations. Some of you, very nicely, began reflecting on the subject position of the observer. what does it mean to be an observer? And some of you, and I thought this was very interesting, at least one of you, made the point that as students, you feel like you are very often the observed rather than the observer. And for you, the position of observer was one of power. That was not something that I expected as an insight in this exercise, but it was a very interesting one, and one I'll be thinking a little bit more about. There may be more to being an observer than power, but certainly power is part of it. And if that's the case, then we need to take into account that dynamic as well when we're thinking about our relationship to the thing that we're observing. Some of you also reflected a little bit on the nature of field work, and quite a few of you spoke of the patience required to complete the exercise. And of course, you were just looking at something for an hour, and think about how most field work is carried out, right? It's hundreds of hours, sometimes more than hundreds of hours, thousands of hours of field work are required to get enough data to have that data make any sense at all. So our brief experiment with an hour showed you, right, some of the rigors of that kind of work. Some of you also demonstrated a high level of critical thinking, and this manifested itself in a few ways. Sometimes it meant that you didn't jump to conclusions about what you were seeing. Sometimes it meant that you questioned in a kind of ongoing way the interpretations that you were making of your data. And sometimes it meant that you remained very open-minded about the data that you were recording. And sometimes it meant that you understood the limitations of the experiment. Right? You understood what you couldn't really comment on because you had so little data and such a little short amount of time to really be making large interpretive statements. So I think all of those things were very, very good. And I want to encourage you, right, as observers and as thinkers in general, to hold those principles dear, right, to hold the principle of A, remaining open-minded, right, to materials, to the data that you're collecting or looking at, examining. B, right, that you don't jump to conclusions about what that data might mean. C, that you really question the interpretations that you do offer, and do that in an ongoing way. And D, that you understand always, right, the limits of your experiment. There were some significant weaknesses in the reflections as well, and I want to mention one of them in particular, because it's something that I saw repeatedly and that is of some concern to me. And this was that some of you made quite wild generalizations about the similarities between human animals and non-human animals. And I think that you may have done it because you thought that this is what I wanted to hear, that I wanted to hear that bears or pandas or anything, right, was somehow exactly like us. That is not really accurate. So we can certainly observe, right, as living organisms, we certainly share certain things. Right? We certainly share a desire for survival. We share, very likely, a large emotional range. But we are not identical in any way. And I would point us back to the very first readings, where a lot of you mentioned some of the problems with theories that saw that just looked at all, every being in a species as being the same. So all dogs do this, or all cows do this, all humans do that. Right? There's not only, of course, enormous variations between and among individuals of the same species, but enormous variations and differences between and among different species. Right? So we should, I think, right now sort of get control of the desire to generalize, right? To say things like a mother blank, right? Puffin, panda, bear, you name it, acts just like a human mother. Not quite. Not exactly. We can, maybe really what you're observing is that there appears to be a similar a similar desire to care for something, or a similar nurturing quality, various things like this. But be cautious in your language, be deeply observant, and observe differences as much as you observe similarities. Okay. So, with those things in mind, I want to think a little bit more about the readings that you've done over the past week, or maybe some of you are just getting through them now, and to talk a little bit about some of the large questions that I think those readings pose. So both of the required readings were from Mark Beckoff's book, The Emotional Lives of Animals. And I'm sure that you are aware of this, but if you're not, Beckoff is an ethologist. He is a highly trained, qualified scientist. He's not a kind of feel-good writer, although this book is rather popular and has a kind of popular approach as opposed to a strictly sort of data-driven approach. Two chapters there, right? The Case for Animal Emotions and Beastly Passions. And then the recommended reading, the reading that I recommend very, very highly, is a collaborative essay by Masson and McCarthy, Grief, Sadness, and the Bones of Elephants. Very beautiful essay, and I think in some ways more beautifully written than Beckoff, and has a lovely sort of complement of data and interpretation. So what are some of the large conceptual issues that are touched on in the readings that you'll be writing about this week? First of all, I would say that there's a question implicit in them. And that question is, how does science begin to answer questions concerning animal emotion? Right? What are the problems with answering those questions? And what routes might we take towards answering them? And what kinds of research has been done, right, in things like neurology, animal behavior, various other fields that help us begin to get a handle on how to ask those questions and how to answer them. A second question is a question that is in some ways a very difficult question to answer, but I'm hoping that maybe some of you will tackle it. And this question is, what is the place of story in science? In other words, right, many people, Beckoff included, right, include anecdotes or stories or narratives, and what we might in some senses call qualitative as opposed to quantitative data in their works. How does that work, right? Why is science, or why is story important to science? What does it have to contribute to science? What might be some of the problems in using story in science? And I'll leave this as an open debate, and you can take both sides of the issue if you like, or you can argue strongly one way or the other. But it's a question I think very much worth considering, particularly when we're talking about behaviors or emotions, in this case, right, emotions, feelings, sentience, that are hard to do quantitative analyses of. Third is a question that is such a broad question that I almost hesitate to ask it. And in some ways, I'd like you more simply to be thinking about this question than trying to formulate a cohesive blog post about it, because I think at this stage it's too big of a question. But the question I'd like you to have kind of in your minds is, what is the proper relationship between science and ethics? And when I say ethics, I really mean ethics. I don't necessarily mean morality. Right? They're related, but they're not the same thing. So before you even answer the question, ask yourself, what is ethics? And how do science and ethics, what is the proper relationship between those things? A fourth question, which I think you could compose a very coherent and interesting blog post on at this point, is what is humanocentrism? And what is the paradigm shift that Beckoff is calling for in our relationship to animals? And why does he think that such a shift is necessary. A fifth question, which seems like a very simple question, but I think it raises a lot of other not so simple questions. And that's, what is sentience? What is that? And if something has sentience, how do we, what is our proper relationship to it? What can we do to it? What can't we do to it? What do we have to think about once we recognize a being as having sentience? And finally, a question that really sends you back to the reading, I think in important ways, and that's, what feelings or emotions do we commonly attribute to animals, and what uncommon emotions do Beckhoff and other scientists, researchers in animal behavior now see evidence of in animals? That's a lot to think about for this week, and I very much look forward to your blog posts. I know it's been a hectic couple of weeks with the CritterCam exercise and now the regular blog post, but I think you can do it, and I'm very encouraged by the progress you're making so far. So I'm standing by, obviously, for any questions or concerns. You can always feel free to email me. You're more than welcome to set up an appointment to Skype or do FaceTime or however you'd like to meet. And I wish you well in the readings and the writings, and I very much look forward to looking at your blogs. All right, take care.